Hey everyone, today I thought we'd try something a little bit differently, and that is the fact that I want to go over my main 5 weapons that I would love to see being added into Monster Hunter, whether it is the next mainline entry, whether it is to the upcoming interesting mobile release of the game as well. Certainly everyone almost has a weapon that they would love to see being added into this franchise, and in this video I'm going to be going over my 5 most hopeful weapons that we see added into Monster Hunter. But at the same time, I want to encourage everyone to let me know in the comments what type of weapon they would love to see being added as well, since almost everyone has a favorite weapon that they love to use, and more important, a weapon that they wish they could be able to use, but certainly cannot as of this point in time. And right out of the gate, of course, I have to mention Tonfas, because they were simply put some of the more unique weapons when they were added into Frontiers, and now that we are seeing the developers finally begin to embrace the Frontiers monsters, the Frontier armors, the Frontier lore, hopefully the weapons also eventually make their way into the main Monster Hunter games. Of course, Tonfas were naturally fast-hitting weapons that were almost like dual blades in that regard, and they were extremely reliant on not just positioning but also sharpness. This was one of the key factors that you needed to make sure to keep them sharp and continually moving, since they had 2 specific different modes for you to be able to use: the long mode and the short mode. The long mode was more focused on like normal impact, kind of like the traditional format, where the long one was more specifically for zonal attacks. Think of it like short AoE, if you will. Not only did you have specific moves that were tied to those weapons based on the Frontiers moniker, which of course that wouldn't necessarily translate over now. Maybe Silkbind attacks are probably the closest thing that we have now to that, to signature attacks that were available before. But of course, at the end of the day, just having the freedom to be able to use those type of weapons, again, it would be something that I think a lot of people would be very happy to see. And again, with the introduction of just more lore, more monsters, more armor sets from Frontiers, I think it would be a nice addition for them to finally embrace Tonfas into their main Monster Hunter franchise, and of course, make them an additional weapon to whatever the next mainline is, whether it is Monster Hunter 6, Monster Hunter World 2, whatever they end up calling it, or even Paradise, which I know a lot of people were indifferent to, but I think it's a very good name at the end of the day. Now, weapon introduction that I think would be very similar to the Tonfas would just simply be fist type weapons, or something that we actually ended up seeing in Dauntless, the Monster Hunter-like game that came out a few years back. In that game, they were called Ether Strikers, and they were just simply fist weapons. If you have played any sort of like traditional Final Fantasy game, you would know that fist weapons are just blunt damage weapons. They would just be considered raw damage. Of course, they could have elemental ties to it, specifically based on the weapon that you equip, based on, of course, just a monster that you decided to take down. But simply put, they were more focused on just raw damage. Some of them could be focused on pierce, but at the end of the day, could be just focused specifically in Monster Hunter for raw damage. And fist weapons in traditional Final Fantasy games have been just monk-based weapons. You see a lot of just physical combo attacks with your hands, of course, primarily being used. Sometimes you will see some characters use kicks, but that's kind of like something that Tonfas already introduced, so I wouldn't necessarily expect them to like overlay one with another. But fist weapons were more traditionally focused, specifically also in Dauntless, as like fist-focused main weapons. And this is something that, like I said, Final Fantasy games have added and have had as an available class or a weapon type for a very long time. I do find it interesting that they just simply never decided to add those into Monster Hunter. I guess dual blades kind of like fulfill that role if you really want to focus on close combat with a specific weapon attached. But of course, fists can add a different variation to that, which I think would be an interesting twist, especially the movement aspect of it, where dual blades and Tonfas are fast moving. Fist weapons are traditionally slower moving weapons, but they have a much higher damage output. So there is a little bit of a difference, balance, and playstyle that could be introduced with them as well. Now, the second Final Fantasy type of weapon that I think would make a great addition to the Monster Hunter franchise is, of course, the Gunblade. And I wouldn't be the first person to suggest this. I think I've seen multiple people in social media suggest this over the years, that Gunblades not only do look cool, but of course are a relatively interesting weapon type that we haven't necessarily seen being kind of like put at the forefront of games for a long time. Now, of course, they were originally introduced in Final Fantasy VIII as Squall's main weapon. This was, of course, Tetsuya Nomura's first addition, I guess, if you will, for this type of weapon type. Essentially, in that game, they worked as just long swords. As you charge them up, you eventually had some sort of explosion blast, a trigger, if you will, activation for elemental damage. With that said, though, by the time Final Fantasy XIII rolled around, Lightning, the main character in that series, was wielding the Blaze Fire Saber, the signature weapon in that game. And of course, that was also a gunblade, but a much different type of gunblade. It was just a traditional longsword originally, but it could shift over to be a just normal, kind of like automatic, semi-automatic gun. So it looked different than Squall's original design weapon, where it was clearly just a gun handle being gripped as a traditional gun, but of course with a long blade attached to it, which originally was working as just a long sword type of weapon with, you build up a gauge presumably, and then of course have access to those explosive attacks, gun type attacks, where in Final Fantasy XIII, Lightning could just simply swap him back and forth. It would actually shift the complete look of the weapon, and you could just have full access to a semi-automatic small gun at the same time, but also switch over automatically to just a traditional sword. So the gunblade worked very differently in those two specific games, and since then it has been introduced in a couple of other Final Fantasy games, where you have the example of like Final Fantasy XII's Ross Algetti's gun, which look very similar to a gunblade. We don't necessarily know if that is what it ends up being. That is definitely what it looks like, but it acts more like a gun and actually looks a little bit closer to a gun lance without the actual shield side of it. So there is some sort of similarities there. Of course, the charge up build from using it as a long sword or a blade or a saber to a traditional setup to eventually blast away as a gun type weapon would be something that they would have to come up with in a deliberate gameplay mechanical style that just simply doesn't quite exist even in the Final Fantasy world. That's just something that they haven't necessarily pinned down because they've kind of messed around with that weapon in different games, but they haven't necessarily nailed down one specific way. Do you play it as a saber? Do you play it as a charge up weapon to eventually use the gun type as an explosive blast? Do you focus more as a range type of weapon that can also be used as a close combat melee weapon? All that is still up in the air. We haven't necessarily seen it, this true signature style being added into, but of course Monster Hunter can bring with it its very own unique ideas. Now the next weapon that I think would be an interesting and downright hilarious addition to the game would be the Bladed Wazaga, or the Umbrella. This is something that you will be able to see, of course, being in full effect in the upcoming Wild Hearts EA Monster Hunter type game release. This is a weapon that they are introducing for the very first time specifically for that franchise, and it's simply put an insect glaive. There's no real twist around it. It is a more traditional insect glaive type of weapon in the way that it mechanically actually plays, but it's just simply used as a parasol, a type of umbrella type weapon. If you have already seen any sort of gameplay kind of already posted on YouTube regarding the Bladed Wazaga, what you're going to notice is that this weapon traditionally starts off in the ground. You're waving your parasol around, either open or closed. It really just focuses on either kind of like AoE slashes, kind of like long sword type of attacks, but then eventually you see your character like elevate itself into the air and then eventually use that motion as a launcher to be able to lift themselves up in the air, very insect glaive like, and then just kind of wield attacks up in the air in the sky, mount the monster a little bit and be able to take give it a little bit of a pounding in the air. So it's one of those weapons that traditionally it would simply play very similar to the insect glaive. Of course, mechanically it's just very similar, but of course it brings its very own nuances to it. There is a lot of aerial shifting, there is a lot of combo opportunity there mid up in the air, and while it doesn't necessarily seem like it could stay up in the air all the time, it is one of those weapons that does seem to be more aerial focused specifically for that game. And when it comes to Monster Hunter, of course they could come up with their very own unique twist to it. And of course, if Wild Hearts is set to be one of those games that will just come and go and by the wayside, kind of like Token did as they try to take on Monster Hunter, at the very least one of the good additions, one of the good ideas the Monster Hunter could potentially add is the fact that this is a umbrella parasol type weapon that It looks very unique Japanese. Of course, this is something that Monster Hunter thrives upon, but also a very interesting and unique idea to finally bring in that type of flavor of a weapon into the Monster Hunter fold. Now, the last weapon that I would love to see them add into the Monster Hunter fold is, of course, a small siege weapon that you can actually bring with you into a hunt. Now, hear me out, because this one is a little bit weird, but that is why I left it for last, because this is just probably the most unique out of all the weapons. Now, siege weapons are already available in Monster Hunter. They are part of kind of like traditional hunting. Like if you're going to take down a big monster, siege weapons have been around since, I believe, like the third game. Maybe they were introduced in the second one, but I don't remember. So we're just going to go with that. In the third game, they were introducing siege weapons as you were taking on really big, heavy monsters. And eventually you need something more than just a couple of hunters' main bladed weapons to be able to take down a monster. Now, of course, in Rise and Sunbreak, we have rampages, and rampages give you full access to siege weapons. But siege weapons are usually stationary because they're big and they're heavy. But what if you have access to being able to bring a smaller siege weapon that can give you full access to the power of a siege weapon, or at the very least 70 to 60% of the power of a siege weapon, which is a whole heck of a lot more than what a traditional normal hunter can actually dish out, and at the same time be able to give you that flexibility of just using all types of siege weapons. So this would be just normal guns where you typically are just singing spears at a monster. Of course, you have access to the cannons. Of course, you have access to the flamethrowers, which are already available as a siege weapon. But also something interesting that I kind of thought about, well, what if you have access to just normal traditional items that you don't necessarily have seen a lot of use for anymore? And I'm talking about poison smoke bombs, flash bombs, sonic bombs, barrel bombs, large barrel bombs, mega barrel bombs, and even poison meats like tinged meat, drugged meat, and the works. Even trank bombs, I guess, could be thrown into that addition. Where I'm just simply saying, like, what if you have a siege weapon that, yes, it can be used as a siege weapon. You can actually step into it, use it, then step out if, of course, the monster is going to attack you. It can certainly get destroyed. This is something that I would actually see Wild Hearts attempting to be able to, like, build into the game. It does ultimately get destroyed, and then you can actually rebuild it. So there will have to be some sort of mechanism where you can rebuild this weapon on the fly while taking time, of course, away, cuts away into your DPS and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you can rebuild it back up, set it up, get into it. And if you do have to use like flash bombs or poison bombs or barrel bombs, if you can like toss them at a monster, that would be just something that gets added into as an added effect, as an added bonus. These are items that are like traditionally based Monster Hunter experience, but as we continue to focus more on like more action, more agile, more movement, and even now spirit burst, which kind of just boost you up to another level in a specific hunt, you no longer necessarily see hunters using flash bombs, smoke bombs, sonic bombs. I don't think I've ever seen anyone use one in like Monster Hunter, like at all, ever. Maybe like back in like when you were fighting Diablos in like Monster Hunter 3, but I haven't seen sonic bombs used efficiently or like ever, probably since Nibble Snarf. So, you know, it's one of those things where like they just like don't really feel useful anymore, but they're still in the game. So why don't we bring those back, make them useful as an added addition to a siege weapon type that can eventually be, you know, a little bit of a slog to be able to play through. But of course, if you remember, Generations Ultimate introduced that bomb mode that you had available with you, that there were different playstyles and bombs. So it's like if you shake that big barrel, you could be getting plenty of buffs, and that was a nice addition to that game. So of course, now maybe bringing something similar to that as a weapon type, I think would go a long way. But I certainly want to hear everyone's opinions on what type of weapon they would love to see being added into Monster Hunter, a weapon type of your choice that you think could make the cut and of course make their way into the next mainline game. If you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up, and as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.